All right, everyone, get ready, because today we're going deep into a world where how we talk and the society we're in are, like, totally connected. It's all about language and society. And to help us navigate this, we've got some excerpts from Buku 20 Language 20 and 20 Society.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I think so. Now, think about this. Have you ever noticed how you, like, change up your words depending on who you're talking to?
Oh, all the time.
Like, different words with your friends versus at work, maybe?
Yeah, it's actually more common than you might think.
Really?
It's a big part of something called sociolinguistics.
Oh, sociolinguistics.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of academic.
It is a bit.
Can we break that down? What's it all about?
Well, basically, it's looking at how society and language kind of affect each other. It's a two-way street.
Okay, a two-way street. I like that.
Yeah, so like the way we speak can tell you things about our social class, where we're from, even our age.
Wow.
But then at the same time, language itself can like reinforce social norms and even create divisions sometimes.
So it's not just about accents then?
No,
No.
there's more to it.
Way more. For example, sociolinguists, they might look at how working class speakers tend to use double negatives like, I don't want none.
Right.
It's not bad grammar or anything like that.
No,
It's a pattern that's connected to their social group, you see.
that's really interesting. It's like a secret code almost.
In a way, yeah.
Is that different from the sociology of language then? Good question. You're right, they are different.
Okay.
Sociology of language kind of flips the focus.
No.
Instead of asking how society shapes language, it asks how language shapes society. See the difference?
Ah, got it. It's all about perspective then.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, where does pragmatics fit into all of this? I remember seeing that in the material.
You're right. Pragmatics is definitely connected. While sociolinguistics looks at the broad, like, social factors, pragmatics really zooms in on how we actually use language in real conversations. Like, how we figure out what someone really means, even if they don't say it directly.
Right, like reading between the lines.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, I think I'm starting to see the connections here. It's not just the words themselves, it's about the whole situation, who's saying them, and why.
Got it.
And speaking of situations, the material talks about all these different factors that can, like, actually influence how we speak.
Yeah.
Things like our social class, where we grew up, our ethnicity, even our gender.
Right. It's all connected.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about how much goes into every single word we say.
I know, right?
So let's break down some of these factors,
Okay.
okay? What really stood out to you in the material?
Well, one that I always find interesting is social class.
Social class.
Like in that movie My Fair Lady, where the professor can tell exactly where someone was from just by listening to them.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Sociolinguists actually study that kind of thing in real life.
So it's not just a movie thing, it's actual science.
Yeah.
So how does that play out in, like, everyday language then?
Well, for instance, research has shown that people from higher social classes, they often use more complex sentences and a bigger vocabulary.
Hold on. Are we saying that people from lower social classes use, like, simpler language? That doesn't sound right.
No, it's not about being simpler or better or anything like that.
Okay.
It's about different patterns
Yeah.
that are connected to different life experiences. Think about it. If you've had a good education,
Right.
you're more likely to be exposed to, complex language.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean your way of speaking is better.
No.
It's just different.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about recognizing that there are all these different ways of speaking and not judging them.
Exactly. And then, beyond social class, there's where we come from, our geographical origins. It's not surprising that people from different places, they develop their own accents and dialects, right?
Right.
But sociolinguists, they go deeper than that. They look at how those variations actually reflect cultural differences and historical influences.
It's like every region has its own flavor of language.
That's a good way to put it.
And that can lead to some pretty funny misunderstandings when people from different areas try to communicate.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we've got social class, we've got where we're from. What about gender?
Ah, yes, gender. The material mentions how men and women might have different patterns in how they use language, like, how much they talk or even their intonation.
Yeah, we've all heard those stereotypes about women being chattier. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it's more nuanced than that. Some studies suggest women tend to use more cooperative language,
Okay.
while men might be more assertive in their communication style. But again, it's about patterns, not absolutes.
Right. Not about putting people in boxes.
Exactly.
But just understanding that, yeah, these social things, they really do shape how we talk.
For sure. And then there's age. It's pretty obvious that teenagers use different slang and words compared to, say, their grandparents, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But sociolinguists are interested in how language changes across our entire lifespan.
So it's not just about trendy slang.
Nope.
There's more to it.
Definitely. Think about how our language becomes more complex as we get older, or how we might start using more formal language when we're working or in professional settings.
Right.
Sociolinguists track all those shifts, and they analyze what it means about our changing roles and who we are.
Wow. It's amazing how much is happening under the surface of our everyday conversations.
It really is.
It's like we're always sending these messages about our background, our social standing, even our age, without even realizing it.
That's the cool thing about sociolinguistics.
Yeah.
It reveals those hidden layers of language and how it's connected to everything we do.
And speaking of communication, before we go too far down the sociolinguistics road, shouldn't we define what communication even is? It seems like it's more than just talk.
You're absolutely right. It's much broader than that. It's about transmitting information.
Okay.
Or messages between people to try and reach some sort of shared understanding.
Shared understanding, okay.
And it can happen through all sorts of channels.
Yeah.
Emails, letters, the radio, even nonverbal cues.
Like body language.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not just about the words, it's about how they're said and everything around them, too.
You're getting it.
And that leads us to that general communication idea from the source material, right? That more informal, everyday kind of talking.
Yeah, the stuff that isn't always structured or planned.
Right, just that constant back and forth we do all day.
Exactly. It's spontaneous, it's messy, it's creative.
But even in all that, language still plays a big role, doesn't it?
Huge role.
It's how we get our thoughts and ideas across to someone else.
Couldn't agree more.
And it doesn't always have to be with actual words, right?
Right. Think about your tone of voice or facial expressions.
Yeah, yeah.
They can say a lot without saying a word.
So even when we're not really thinking about the words we're using, we're still communicating through all those other signals.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that. Now, the material also goes into these communication models and elements.
Right.
What are those all about? There's one from Lewis, I think, back in 1987. What's that one like?
So in Lewis's model, communication is seen as an open system.
An open system.
Where messages are like sent and received through different forms, channels, all for a specific purpose.
So it's not like I just throw a word at you and you catch it. It's more back and forth.
Much more. There's a constant flow of information between the people involved.
Gotcha. And who are those key players again?
We've got the sender, the receiver, the message itself, the channel it goes through, and the target audience.
It's like a dance with lots of moving parts.
A great way to put it. Now, the material also talks about this idea of perfect communication from Robbins in '84.
Perfect communication.
Yeah.
Doesn't that sound a bit impossible? I mean, we all misunderstand things sometimes.
You're right. It is. And that's what Robbins was getting at.
Okay.
He suggested that in a perfect communication, it would happen only if the receiver completely understood what the sender meant. No mistakes.
Like no room for interpretation at all.
Exactly. But in reality, that just doesn't happen.
No.
We all bring our own stuff to communication. Biases, experiences, even our mood at the time.
So it's more of an ideal than something we can achieve.
I think so. And recognizing that is key to being a better communicator. Helps us be more aware of our message, who we're talking to, and how things could be misunderstood.
I'm starting to see why communication is such a rich and complex topic.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it just gets more fascinating the deeper we go. But we'll save that for the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, sounds good. Welcome back, everyone. I don't know about you, but I'm finding all these layers of communication pretty fascinating.
It really is like peeling back an onion.
Yeah.
The more you look at it, the more you find that.
Right. And before the break, we were talking about that perfect communication idea.
Right.
Where the receiver understands the sender's message perfectly with no misunderstandings.
Yeah.
But I think we both agreed that's pretty much impossible.
It is. The source material really emphasizes that communication.
Yeah.
It's not just about transmitting information.
Okay.
It's really about creating a shared understanding.
Shared understanding.
Which is a lot more complex.
I bet.
Both people, the sender and the receiver, they have to actively participate.
Right.
For that to happen.
It's like a two-way street. You're constantly making sure you're both on the same page.
Exactly. And if we kind of keep going with that metaphor, you could say that language is like the roadmap
The roadmap.
For the conversation.
Yeah.
It gives us the structure,
Right.
the words, so we can understand each other.
And just like different maps highlight different things, different languages and dialects. They carry different cultural nuances.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It shows why social context matters so much in how we communicate. What might be polite in one culture could be, completely wrong in another.
Oh, that reminds me of when I was traveling in Japan.
Ah.
I accidentally offended someone by making direct eye contact.
Oh!
It turns out that's seen as aggressive there.
Wow, yeah. That's a perfect example of how cultural differences can lead to those kinds of miscommunications.
Right. Even when we think we're speaking the same language, there are all these hidden rules.
There are.
So it's not just the words themselves, but how they're said.
Right.
And all that unspoken cultural stuff.
Exactly. And that's where sociolinguistics is so helpful.
Yeah.
It helps us understand those differences. And remember that language always exists within a certain context.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's funny, when we talk about communication,
Yeah.
we usually just think about, like, the talking, the words.
Right.
But the source material mentions nonverbal communication, too.
Oh, absolutely. Facial expressions, body language, even tone of voice. They can all communicate so much. Some researchers even think that nonverbal cues can be stronger than words in certain situations.
Yeah, like that saying, actions speak louder than words. Sometimes our body language gives us away, even if we're saying the right things.
Exactly. And you know what's fascinating?
What?
Is how those nonverbal cues, they can be so different in different cultures.
Oh, right. Like a gesture could mean one thing here and something totally different somewhere else.
Exactly.
So good communication, it means being aware of all those layers, the words, the delivery, and the culture, right?
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's a lot to juggle.
It is. And remember, it's always changing.
Right.
As we talk to different people and, navigate all these social situations.
It kind of reminds me of a river, the way it changes course
I like that.
as it flows.
And just like a river shapes the land around it, communication shapes our social world.
And the other way around, too, right? Like the landscape shapes the river. Society influences how we communicate.
Right. That's the dynamic we're looking at here.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. The source material also mentions other ways humans communicate.
Oh, right.
Beyond speaking and writing. Do you remember those?
Vaguely.
Like using light or whistles or even semaphores, those flags.
Oh, right. Yeah.
They may not be as detailed as spoken language,
No.
but they still serve a purpose, like a lighthouse using light to warn ships about danger.
Right. Or people using semaphore to send messages across long distances.
Yeah.
Before the telegraph.
It just shows how creative humans can be when we want to connect and share information.
It does.
Speaking of connecting, let's go back to sociolinguistics for a second.
Okay.
Remember all those factors that can influence how people speak, like social class, geography, and gender? It's mind-blowing how much goes into every word we say.
It is.
Well, the source material takes it even further. It talks about how those factors create these distinct language varieties.
Oh, yeah.
Not just individual differences, but actual patterns within certain groups.
Like how certain slang is popular with teenagers, or how people from a certain region might have their own dialect.
Exactly.
Those variations, we call them sociolects.
Sociolinguistics, okay.
They can carry a lot of meaning. They signal who you belong with, your social status,
Right.
and they can even reinforce social boundaries.
So some ways of speaking are seen as more prestigious or powerful than others,
Unfortunately, yes.
even though those judgments are totally made up.
Right, and that's what sociolinguistics helps us do. Analyze those dynamics and see how language can both reflect and create those inequalities.
That's a heavy thought.
It is.
It makes you realize that language isn't just about grammar and words.
No,
It's wrapped up in all these social forces.
It is. And it's important to remember those varieties and sociolects, they aren't fixed.
Right.
They change as society changes.
Well, yeah, with new technologies, new ways of doing things, even people moving around and interacting with different cultures, it's natural that language would change too.
Exactly. Think about how the internet and social media have changed things. New slang, abbreviations, even emojis are changing how we communicate.
It's like language is this living thing that adapts to its environment.
I love that. That's a great way to put it. Now, thinking about all this change, I'm curious, how do you think this digital age is changing the relationship between language and society? How are all these new technologies affecting the way we speak and interact?
That's a great question. It's something we'll have to think about more in the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back, everyone. We've been talking a lot about language and society, and before the break, we were just starting to touch on the impact of the digital age.
Yeah, it's really amazing to see how much the internet has changed things.
It feels like a whole new world of language is being created online, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The speed at which new slang and ways of communicating spread online is incredible. It really is. But even with all this change, it seems like those basic ideas we talked about still hold true, don't they? Like people's backgrounds and social groups, they still shape how they use language online.
You're exactly right. It's not like the internet just wipes away all those social forces.
Right.
In fact, it might even amplify some of them.
Really?
Yeah, like research shows that online communities often develop their own dialects and slang based on shared interests or identities.
That makes sense. It's like finding new ways to connect with people who are like you.
Exactly.
But then those online interactions, they can kind of bleed into the real world too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think about, like, cyberbullying.
Right.
Hurtful language online can have serious real-world consequences.
It's a good reminder that what happens online isn't separate from real life.
It's all connected.
It is.
Yeah.
And just like in face-to-face communication, we really need to be careful about the language we use online and think about how it might affect others.
I agree. Language has power, whether it's spoken, written, or typed on a screen.
It does.
It can bring people together or tear them apart.
It's like a tool we can use for good or bad.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to the core of what sociolinguistics is all about.
Yeah.
Understanding that deep connection between language and society, how they constantly shape each other.
It's been so interesting looking at all these different parts of language and communication.
Yeah.
From social dialects to nonverbal cues, and now this digital revolution.
I know, there's so much to learn.
There is. But I think the most important thing we've seen is that language isn't just a way to communicate.
Right.
It's a reflection of who we are, where we come from, how we see the world.
You got it. It's like each of us carries around this unique linguistic fingerprint
I like that.
made up of our own experiences and our place in society.
That's a great way to put it. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
And it's time to wrap things up. But before we do, I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
It has. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of language and society. We hope it's giving you some new perspectives to think about.
And maybe even spark some curiosity.
Exactly. So keep those linguistic gears turning, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Welcome to our deep dive.
Yeah.
Into effective communication.
Yeah.
It seems like you've been giving this a lot of thought lately.
Yeah, definitely a lot to consider.
All these sources. What's the big takeaway here for you?
Well, it seems like we use language not just to, just share information, but to actually do things in the world.
Right.
It's not just about, conveying a message. It's about actually making things happen.
It's almost like we have this power.
Yeah.
With our words.
Absolutely. And I think we often take communication for granted.
Yeah.
We think of it as simply conveying messages, but these sources really reveal it's so much more than that.
Okay, so one source even compares effective communication to glue. What do they mean by that?
Well, think about what glue does. It
Right.
holds things together.
Right.
It creates a bond. Effective communication does the same thing in relationships. It helps us build understanding, trust, connection.
Okay.
Without that glue of communication, things can fall apart pretty quickly.
It's fascinating how that analogy really kind of puts it into perspective.
Yeah.
Because you don't think about it that way usually.
Right.
Like that's the purpose of communication, is to create these bonds.
Yeah.
And it's not just about being quick and efficient, is it?
Right.
Like firing off a rushed email, just to get it off your plate.
Totally.
There's a bigger picture.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've hit on a key point there.
Okay.
The sources emphasize that distinction between efficiency and effectiveness.
Oh.
So efficiency prioritizes, speed,
Right.
getting the message out there.
Like checking a box.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as you said, a rushed email can lack context or leave things unclear.
Oh, for sure.
And that leads to more confusion down the line.
Been there.
Oh, yeah.
So many times.
We all have.
Yeah.
And that's where effectiveness comes in. It means considering the receiver's perspective, taking the time to really provide that context and ensure the message is truly understood.
Uh-huh.
And that leads to clarity and shared understanding, which are way more valuable in the long run.
Right, because then you don't have to go back and
Exactly.
rehash everything.
That's saving time and energy.
So it's not just about getting the words out there, but also making sure they have the intended impact.
That's a great way to put it.
One of the sources broke down a conversation about fixing a computer.
Okay.
And it wasn't just, a simple request and response. There were questions, clarifications, back and forth.
Yeah.
And it made me realize it's not just what we say, but how we say it, and all the little unspoken signals we're sending along the way.
That's a perfect example of a speech event, which we'll dive into a little bit later.
Okay.
But you're right. Communication involves so many layers.
Yeah.
And one of the most important is nonverbal cues.
Yeah.
One source said, and I love this quote, "We convey much of what we care about through body language."
Wow.
So think about it.
Okay.
A simple smile can instantly convey warmth and openness.
Right.
While avoiding eye contact can signal discomfort or disinterest.
I never really thought about it that way.
Yeah.
But it's so true.
Right.
Those nonverbal cues can really change the whole tone of a conversation.
Exactly. And the sources emphasize how those cues can vary across cultures, ages, and even emotional states. So a gesture that's friendly in one context could be offensive in another.
Oh, wow.
And the sources point out that being sensitive to these differences is crucial for clear communication.
So how do we navigate this
Right.
complex world of nonverbal cues?
Well, the sources offer some great tips.
Okay.
One is to be mindful of those individual differences and the context.
Okay.
Another is to make sure our body language aligns with our words.
Right.
So we're not sending mixed messages.
Right. You got to walk the walk.
Exactly. And of course, paying attention to the other person's nonverbal cues can give us valuable insights into what they're really feeling and thinking.
So it's almost like we're learning a whole new language here.
It is. It is.
Okay, so we've got effective communication as the glue that binds us, the difference between efficiency and effectiveness.
Yes.
This whole world of nonverbal cues. Where do we go from here?
Well, let's delve deeper into those speech events that you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
It seems like different social situations have their own unspoken rules and expectations for how we communicate.
Right, like how I talk to my boss is totally different from how I talk to my friends.
Exactly.
At a bar.
Exactly. And that awareness is key to effective communication. It's not just about the words themselves, but also the intentions, the social norms, even the expected outcome of the interaction. For example, if someone asks, "How's it going at the grocery store?"
Right.
You probably don't launch into a detailed explanation of your day.
You just say, "Good, how are you?" and keep going.
Exactly. It's more of a quick pleasantry than a genuine request for information.
Right.
But in another context, that same phrase could lead to a much deeper conversation.
Absolutely.
Right. So the meaning changes based on the speech event.
Okay.
And here's where things get even more interesting.
Good.
The sources introduce this concept of speech acts, which suggests that we actually do things with words, not just describe the world.
Wait, what do we mean?
Well, consider a judge pronouncing a sentence in court. Or someone saying, "I promise," during a wedding ceremony.
Right.
Those words aren't just statements.
Right.
They actually have the power to change something. Like, think about it.
Right.
I pronounce you husband and wife.
Yeah.
That's not just describing a marriage. It's actually making it happen.
It's wild.
Right.
Yeah.
The sources explain that those are called performative speech acts.
Okay.
And to break it down further, there are different levels to these speech acts. So the locutionary act is simply the act of uttering the words. The illocutionary act is the intended force or action behind the words. And the perlocutionary act is the effect those words have on the listener.
So the same words can have different illocutionary forces depending on the context.
Exactly.
Okay, help me wrap my head around that a little bit more.
Okay, so think of it this way. The locutionary act is just saying the words. The illocutionary act is like the hidden message, what you're really trying to do with those words.
Got it.
And the perlocutionary act is how those words land on the other person, the impact they have.
Right.
So let me give you an example.
Okay.
A bartender announces, "The bar will close in 5 minutes."
Okay.
The locutionary act is the announcement itself.
Right.
But the illocutionary force could be simply informing the customers, or maybe it's a subtle nudge to order one last drink.
Oh.
And the perlocutionary effect could be anything from people rushing to the bar to a collective groan of disappointment.
It's fascinating how those same words
Right.
can have such
Totally different meanings.
different impacts depending on
the context.
the illocutionary force behind them.
Exactly.
It's almost like we're decoding this secret language
Yes.
of communication.
Yeah.
This is making me think about every conversation I've ever had in a whole new light.
I know, me too.
But the sources also point out
Yes.
that there are barriers
Uh-huh.
to effective communication.
Absolutely.
So even if we understand all these nuances, things can still go wrong.
Of course. Of course. That's right. The sources list things like stress, emotional overwhelm, and cultural differences as potential obstacles.
Right.
When we're stressed or feeling overwhelmed, we're more likely to misread others' intentions and send confusing signals ourselves.
Oh, I know that feeling.
Yeah.
I've definitely said things I regret
Totally.
when I'm stressed out.
Yeah.
Like my filter disappears.
Exactly. And that's where self-awareness becomes so important. When we're aware of our own emotional state and how it might be impacting our communication, we can take steps to prevent misunderstandings.
Right.
The sources emphasize that active listening is crucial here too.
Okay.
By really focusing on what the other person is saying, both verbally and non-verbally,
Right.
we can get a clearer picture of their perspective and avoid making assumptions.
That's so important.
It is.
It sounds like the key takeaway here is that effective communication requires constant effort and awareness.
Yes.
Even when we think we've got it all figured out.
Absolutely. It's a skill we can always improve upon.
So we've covered so much in this deep dive.
We have.
Effective communication as the glue that connects us.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between efficiency and effectiveness.
Yeah.
The hidden language of nonverbal cues.
Yeah.
And now all these barriers that get in the way.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much depth there is to something we do every single day.
It's true. We often don't realize how complex and nuanced communication truly is. But by understanding these concepts, we can become more mindful and intentional in our interactions.
What's standing out to you as the biggest takeaway from all these sources?
For me, it's realizing how much we communicate without even realizing it. Every glance, every gesture, every shift in tone of voice.
Wow.
All of it contributes to the messages we send.
There's a lot to be mindful of.
It is.
Yeah.
And becoming aware of those subtle cues can completely change the way we approach communication.
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that effective communication is a two-way street.
Absolutely.
It's not just about expressing ourselves clearly, but also being receptive to what others are communicating.
Yes.
Even if it's not explicitly stated.
But that's a great point. Active listening and a genuine effort to understand the other person's perspective are absolutely essential for building strong connections.
For sure.
And sometimes it means acknowledging that we might be misinterpreting the situation and asking for clarification. Especially if emotions are running high, that can prevent a lot of unnecessary conflict and hurt feelings.
Absolutely. I've definitely been in situations where a simple
Hey, I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Could have saved a lot of trouble.
Exactly. Communication is an ongoing process of learning and adapting. The more we pay attention to these nuances, the better we become at navigating this complex world of human interaction. This deep dive has been incredible. I feel like I have a whole new set of tools to understand and improve my own communication skills.
Oh, that's fantastic to hear.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure, and remember, effective communication is a lifelong pursuit. Keep exploring, keep practicing, and keep those conversations flowing.
I love that.
Yeah.
Great advice. Thank you.
You're welcome. The sources categorize speech events in a few different ways, like classroom versus non-classroom events.
Okay.
And they break it down even further within those categories. Like in the classroom, you might have lectures, discussions, labs, all sorts of different events.
So they're saying we change how we communicate based on the setting.
Exactly.
It makes me think about how my style shifts,
Yeah.
depending on if I'm at work versus hanging out with my friends.
Absolutely.
Like I use way more formal language with my boss
Of course.
than I do, with my buddies.
Right, and that awareness is key to effective communication. It's not just about the words themselves, but also the intentions, the social norms, even the expected outcome of the interaction.
Okay, so give me an example.
Okay, so let's say someone asks, how's it going at the grocery store?
Yeah.
You probably don't launch into a detailed explanation of your day.
No, not at all.
It's more of a quick pleasantry than a genuine request for information.
Exactly.
But in another context, that same phrase could lead to a much deeper conversation.
Totally.
So the meaning changes, based on the speech event.
I'm starting to see how much context matters.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And here's where things get even more interesting.
Okay, lay it on me.
The sources introduce this concept of speech acts, which suggests that we actually do things with words, not just describe the world.
Okay, wait, what do you mean by that?
Well, think about a judge pronouncing a sentence in court.
Okay.
Or someone saying, I promise, during a wedding ceremony.
Yeah.
Those words aren't just statements. They actually have the power to change something.
So like, I pronounce you husband and wife isn't just describing a marriage.
Right.
It's actually making it happen.
Exactly.
Well, yeah.
The sources explain that those are called performative speech acts.
Performative speech acts.
And to break it down even further, there are different levels to these speech acts.
Okay.
So the locutionary act is simply the act of uttering the words. The illocutionary act is the intended force or action behind the words.
Okay.
And the prolocutionary act is the effect those words have on the listener.
So the same words can have different illocutionary forces depending on the context.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Can you help me wrap my head around that a little bit more?
Sure. So think of it this way.
Okay.
The locutionary act is just saying the words.
Okay, got it.
The illocutionary act is like the hidden message, what you're really trying to do with those words.
Okay.
And the prolocutionary act is how those words land on the other person, the impact they have.
Okay, so like a bartender says.
Exactly. Let me give you an example.
Okay.
A bartender announces, the bar will close in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
The locutionary act is the announcement itself.
Right.
But the illocutionary force could be simply informing the customers, or maybe it's a subtle nudge to order one last drink.
Oh, interesting.
And the prolocutionary effect could be anything from people rushing to the bar to a collective groan of disappointment.
So those same words
Yeah.
can have such different impacts,
Completely different meanings.
depending on the illocutionary force behind them.
Exactly.
It's almost like we're decoding the secret language of communication.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. This is making me think about every conversation I've ever had in a whole new light.
Me too. It's really eye-opening.
But the sources also point out there are these barriers to effective communication.
Oh, absolutely.
So even if we understand all these nuances, things can still go wrong.
Of course, things happen.
Yeah.
The sources list things like stress, emotional overwhelm, and cultural differences as potential obstacles.
Yeah, those make sense.
When we're stressed or feeling overwhelmed, we're more likely to misread others' intentions and send confusing signals ourselves.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well.
Don't we all?
I've definitely said things I regret when I'm stressed out.
We've all been there.
It's like my filter just disappears.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's where self-awareness becomes so important.
Okay.
When we're aware of our own emotional state and how it might be impacting our communication,
Right.
we can take steps to prevent those misunderstandings.
So like taking a deep breath before responding.
Exactly. Or maybe even saying, hey, I need a minute to process this.
Right.
The sources emphasize that active listening is crucial here too. By really focusing on what the other person is saying, both verbally and non-verbally, we can get a clear picture of their perspective and avoid making assumptions.
It sounds like the key takeaway here is that effective communication requires constant effort and awareness.
It does.
Even when we think we've got it all figured out.
It's a skill we can always improve upon.
So we've covered so much in this deep dive.
They have.
Effective communication is the glue that connects us, the difference between efficiency and effectiveness,
Yeah.
the hidden language of nonverbal cues, and now these speech events and speech acts.
Right. All these layers.
It's amazing how much depth there is to something we do every single day.
It's true. We often don't realize how complex and nuanced communication truly is.
Yeah.
But by understanding these concepts, we can become more mindful and intentional in our interactions.
What's standing out to you as the biggest takeaway from all these sources?
You know, for me, it's realizing how much we communicate without even realizing it. Every glance, every gesture, every shift in tone of voice,
Right.
all of it contributes to the messages we send.
It's a lot to be mindful of.
It is.
Yeah.
And becoming aware of those subtle cues can completely change the way we approach communication.
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that effective communication is a two-way street.
Absolutely.
It's not just about expressing ourselves clearly, but also being receptive to what others are communicating, even if it's not explicitly stated.
That's a great point. Active listening and a genuine effort to understand the other person's perspective are essential for building those strong connections.
Definitely.
And sometimes it means acknowledging that we might be misinterpreting the situation and asking for clarification, especially if emotions are running high.
Yeah, that can be tough.
It can be, but it can prevent a lot of unnecessary conflict and hurt feelings.
For sure.
Yeah.
I've definitely been in situations where a simple, hey, I'm not sure I understand what you mean, could have saved a lot of trouble.
Exactly. Communication is an ongoing process of learning and adapting. The more we pay attention to these nuances, the better we become at navigating this complex world of human interaction.
This deep dive has been incredible.
Yeah.
I feel like I have a whole new set of tools to understand and improve my own communication skills.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Thank you so much for sharing all these insights with me.
It's been my pleasure.
This has been really valuable.
Good. I'm glad.
This is making me think about, all those conversations I've had,
Yeah.
good and bad.
Uh-huh.
And I'm wondering if I could have handled them differently.
It makes you rethink things, doesn't it?
Totally. Yeah.
What's interesting is the sources emphasize, communication is a skill you can always work on.
Right. It's not like you just learn it once and then
Exactly. It's not a one-time thing.
you're good to go.
It's about being aware and then practicing those skills in real life.
So we're always kind of fine-tuning our approach,
Absolutely.
like almost developing a sixth sense
I like
for
that.
communication.
Yeah, and the more you practice, the more intuitive it becomes. You start to pick up on those subtle cues. Adjust your style accordingly.
It really does open up a whole new level of awareness and understanding.
Does.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening.
Yeah.
It's like we were given this decoder ring for understanding communication.
It's true. You start to see those patterns and you can't unsee them.
Exactly.
It makes you more mindful of the messages you're sending and receiving intentionally and unintentionally.
And it makes you realize how much responsibility we have
Yes.
as communicators.
Absolutely.
Like we have to be aware of the impact of our words and actions on others, even when we don't mean to send a particular message.
It's a powerful reminder.
Yeah, and on the flip side, it also highlights the importance of giving others the benefit of the doubt.
Oh, that's so important.
We can't always assume we're interpreting their messages correctly.
Exactly.
Especially when emotions are high.
Yeah, sometimes it's worth pausing to check our understanding or asking for clarification.
It's so easy to jump to conclusions. But taking a moment to make sure we're on the same page can prevent so much conflict.
Absolutely.
Remember, communication is a two-way street.
It is.
It's not just about expressing ourselves clearly, but also being receptive to what others are trying to communicate.
Active listening, empathy, a willingness to consider different perspectives, those are all essential
For sure.
for healthy, productive relationships.
I feel like I have so much more to learn.
Well, it's a lifelong process, right?
It is.
But I think you're off to a great start.
Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with me.
It's been my pleasure.
I feel so much more equipped to navigate the complexities of communication now.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad to hear that.
It's been amazing breaking down these sources with you.
It's been fun.
And I think our listeners are going to get a lot out of this too.
I hope so.
So to everyone listening out there, remember, effective communication is a journey.
It is.
Keep exploring, keep practicing, and keep those conversations flowing.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Always exciting to be back.
Today, we're going to be looking at some stuff from Sociolinguistics.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, you gave us some excerpts to look at from pasted text.
Right. Yeah, pretty dense textbook.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty academic, but there's some really interesting stuff in there.
It's got some great stuff in there.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at the ideas of bilingualism and then also language and gender.
Okay.
And you reached out to us because you really wanted to see how some of these ideas play out in the real world, particularly in Indonesia.
Right.
So that's what we're going to be focusing on today.
Awesome.
So to jump right in.
Yeah, let's go for it.
You would think that defining bilingualism and multilingualism would be pretty straightforward.
You'd think so, right? I mean, bilingual, two languages, multilingual, more than two.
Exactly.
But it gets really interesting when you consider, like, all the nuances.
Yeah, what makes it so complicated?
Well, on the surface, it seems simple, like you said. Bilingual, two languages, multilingual, more than two. But when you think about the range of proficiencies that people have, like some bilinguals are equally fluent in both languages, while others are dominant in one. And then there's the question of how people become bilingual.
Right.
Some people learn two languages from childhood simultaneously.
Yeah.
Others pick up a second language later in life.
Yeah, and the textbook even goes deeper than that. It talks about these different types of bilinguals,
Oh,
like
yeah.
compound versus coordinate.
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So imagine like someone in Indonesia learning English.
Right.
A compound bilingual might learn English after they already have a really solid foundation in Indonesian.
Okay.
So they might like mentally connect words and concepts between those two languages in their mind.
Uh-huh.
But a coordinate bilingual might learn Indonesian and English in totally separate contexts.
Okay.
Maybe Indonesian at home, English at school. So each language is linked to a different set of experiences and ways of thinking.
That's really fascinating. I like that idea of almost like having two different mental filing cabinets for each language.
Yeah.
Now, based on like your own experiences, can you see how these different types of bilingualism might actually shape someone's worldview?
Oh, absolutely. The type of bilingualism you experience can totally impact like your cognitive processes,
Right.
even your sense of identity.
Wow.
Like, for example, a compound bilingual might have a more integrated sense of self,
Okay.
drawing on both languages really fluidly,
Hmm.
while a coordinate bilingual might experience more distinct shifts in personality
Interesting.
or perspective, depending on which language they're using.
It's almost like code switching between languages could also be like code switching between different aspects of your personality.
Yeah.
And speaking of Indonesia, the textbook highlights that it's home to so many multilingual people.
Right.
And it kind of brings up this question of the role of English,
Yeah.
right, in multilingual societies like Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
And the text mentions this idea of English being subtractive. What does that mean?
Well, it's this concern that as English gains more prominence in a society, that it might displace other languages.
Okay.
So, some people worry that prioritizing English could come at the expense of maintaining other languages and cultures.
Yeah.
It's a complex debate, though.
Yeah, for sure.
There's no easy answers.
It makes you wonder about this balance between embracing global communication and preserving, like, linguistic diversity.
Right.
And the textbook doesn't stop there.
Nope.
It also brings up this term diglossia, which I had never heard before.
Okay.
Here's that.
Diglossia describes a situation where two varieties of the same language exist in a community, and they both have very distinct social functions.
Okay.
So you can think of it as like high and low versions of the same language.
Okay.
So the high language is often more formal. It's used in like education, government, literature.
Uh-huh.
And then the low language is more informal, and that's used for everyday conversation.
So it's not just about, like, different languages. It's about, like, different levels of formality within the same language.
Exactly.
Can you give us an example of that?
Absolutely. So think about Javanese in Indonesia.
Okay.
You have kromo, the high
Yeah.
Javanese, that's used in formal situations when addressing elders or those of higher status.
Okay.
And then you have agoko, which is the low Javanese, which is used for everyday conversation among peers.
Mm-hmm.
So these two varieties of Javanese, they really highlight the social hierarchies and power dynamics that are embedded in language.
It's like language becomes this code for navigating different social situations and showing respect.
Right.
I can definitely see how that would be important in a society like Indonesia with its strong emphasis on social harmony and respect for elders.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how language can reflect those cultural values.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's not just about formality, though. It's also about identity. Right? In Indonesia, with its like incredible linguistic diversity, navigating all these different varieties of language, is part of what shapes a person's sense of belonging within their community.
Totally. Yeah.
So each language or dialect carries like its own cultural weight and social significance.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of social dynamics, let's shift gears a little bit to the chapter on language and gender.
Okay.
The textbook opens with this really provocative question. Why can't a woman talk more like a man?
Yeah, that's getting right to the heart of how deeply intertwined language and gender are.
Yeah.
What assumptions are we making when we say that there's a right way for men and women to speak?
Exactly.
That's what the textbook is asking us to think about.
So it's really pushing us to examine all these preconceived notions that we have
Right.
about how genders use language.
Yeah.
Now, before we dive into that, can you just clarify how linguistics uses the term gender,
Sure.
especially compared to like its use in broader social sciences?
Yeah, good point. So in linguistics, gender often refers to grammatical categories, like masculine and feminine nouns in languages like Spanish or French.
Mhm.
But when you look at the wider social sciences, gender is about the socially constructed roles, behavior, identities associated with being male or female.
Okay.
So it's about how societies shape our understanding of what it means to be a man or a woman. And this, of course, like spills over into how we use language.
So in this context, then, when we're talking about language and gender, we're really looking at how these social constructs of masculinity and femininity impact the way people communicate.
Exactly.
And the textbook gives these lists of typical male and female traits.
Right.
Which honestly feels a bit stereotypical to me.
Yeah, you're right. Those lists do come off as overly simplistic.
Yeah.
But I think what the textbook is trying to do is highlight these common perceptions people have about how men and women speak.
Gotcha.
It's not saying that all men are blunt and all women are chatty, but these stereotypes exist and we need to examine them.
So they're like a springboard for a deeper discussion, not a definitive guide to how genders actually speak.
Right.
Which leads us to the big question. Is there actually such a thing as women's language versus men's language?
The million-dollar question.
Right.
The research on gender differences in language is both complex and often debated.
Okay.
So while it's tempting to give like a simple yes or no answer,
Right.
the reality is far more nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
Some studies have found subtle differences in how men and women use language, but these differences are often small
Gotcha.
and very context-dependent.
So it's not as black and white as saying that, like, women use more adjectives and men interrupt more?
Exactly. It's much more about, like, tendencies and context.
Okay.
For example, the textbook mentions a tendency for women to use language to build relationships and foster connection, while men might lean towards using language to assert dominance or convey information.
Right.
But remember, these are tendencies, not hard and fast rules.
Yeah.
There are plenty of men who are masters of, like, collaborative communication. Right.
And plenty of women who are very direct and assertive.
It seems like understanding the context is really key here.
Absolutely.
Like the way we use language probably changes depending on who we're talking to, where we are, what we're trying to achieve.
Exactly.
I imagine it's the same in Indonesia.
Oh, absolutely. The textbook doesn't go too deep into this, but think about how you might adjust your language.
Right.
Depending on whether you're chatting with your friends, giving a presentation at work, or having a serious conversation with family.
Yeah.
Gender is just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding how people use language.
Right. And all of this is happening within the already complex landscape of Indonesian society.
Yeah.
And the textbook, unfortunately, doesn't provide a ton of specific examples from Indonesia when it comes to language and gender.
That's true. But we can still build on what we know about gender dynamics in Indonesian society.
Okay.
And apply some of the broader concepts that we've been discussing.
For example, are there certain Indonesian terms or phrases that are considered more masculine or feminine?
That's a great question. I know that there are certain terms of address that vary depending on age and status.
Right.
Which could definitely overlap with gender roles.
Yeah.
And I bet there are certain slang words or expressions that are more common among certain groups, whether it's men, women, or specific communities.
Absolutely.
Those are perfect examples of how language reflects these social norms and expectations around gender.
Totally.
It would be fascinating to delve deeper into how these dynamics play out across all the different regions of Indonesia.
Right.
Especially considering its just incredible linguistic diversity.
It's amazing.
And speaking of diversity, let's circle back to bilingualism and multilingualism for a second.
Okay.
The textbook points out that it's quite common for people to speak multiple languages in many parts of the world, including Indonesia.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, how might bilingualism or multilingualism influence these gendered language patterns?
Right. Are men and women navigating multiple languages differently?
Yeah.
Do they code switch in different contexts? Or for different reasons? These are all questions worth exploring.
Yeah, it really highlights how interwoven all of these contexts are.
Totally.
You've got individual language use shaped by gender norms, all within the context of a multilingual society.
Oh, it's fascinating.
It's a great reminder that language is never static.
Right.
It's constantly evolving and adapting to social change.
Yeah.
And that's especially true in Indonesia, where language is so fundamental to identity and culture.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder how external forces like globalization and the spread of English might be impacting language and gender dynamics in Indonesia.
Right. Is there a push to standardize language?
Yeah.
Or are local dialects and languages being actively preserved?
Yeah, and how do those linguistic shifts impact traditional gender roles and expectations.
Right. Are women at the forefront of these language revitalization efforts?
Yeah.
Or are they facing barriers to language access and education?
There's so much to consider.
It's incredible.
We've only just scratched the surface of these topics.
Yeah, we have.
Are you ready to keep exploring in part 2?
Let's do it.
We're back for part 2 of our deep dive.
Part 2. Let's do it.
So we were talking about all these complex ideas of bilingualism and multilingualism.
Right.
And then right at the end, we kind of started to get into language and gender.
Yeah.
And the text brings up this idea of diglossia.
Right.
So can you explain that a little bit more for us? Like, what is that?
So diglossia, that's when you have two varieties of the same language that exist in a community.
Okay.
And they both have distinct social functions.
Okay.
So think of it as like high and low variations of the same language.
Okay, so give us an example of that.
Yeah, so like in Arabic, you've got like the standard or classical Arabic, which is used in like formal writing and religious contexts.
Okay.
But then in everyday speech, people use like a variety of regional dialects that are considered less formal.
So it's almost like two different versions of the same language, but used for different purposes.
Exactly. And that's where the high and low distinction comes in.
Okay.
The high variety is usually associated with prestige and education,
Right.
while the low variety is seen as more informal or colloquial.
And you see this in a lot of languages, right?
Yeah, it's actually quite common.
Like even in English, you could kind of make that argument for certain dialects.
That's true.
So the textbook kind of just jumps into these lists
Yeah.
of different traits,
Right.
supposedly, of how men and women speak,
Right.
which honestly feels a little stereotypical to me.
Yeah, those lists can definitely come across as overly simplistic.
Yeah.
I think what the textbook is trying to get at, though, is that there are these perceived differences in how men and women use language.
Okay.
And these perceptions often stem from broader social norms and expectations about gender.
Right.
So it's not about saying that all men speak one way
Right.
and all women speak another way, but rather that these stereotypes exist. Okay.
And they can influence how we perceive and interpret communication.
Okay, so the lists are more like a starting point
Exactly.
for understanding these broader social dynamics,
Right.
rather than like a definitive guide to how men and women actually speak.
Exactly.
So is there actually any truth to these stereotypes?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
The research on gender differences in language is super fascinating,
Okay.
but also super complex.
Okay.
There have been studies that have found some subtle differences
Okay.
in how men and women use language,
Okay.
but these differences are often pretty small,
Gotcha.
and they can vary a lot depending on the context.
So it's not as clear-cut as saying like women use more tag questions or men interrupt more often.
Right, it's much more nuanced than that.
Okay.
For example, one area where some researchers have observed differences
Okay.
is in how men and women use language to build relationships.
Okay.
So some studies suggest that women tend to use language in ways that foster connection and solidarity.
While men might be more likely to use language to assert dominance or convey information.
But again, these are just tendencies, right?
Exactly. There's tons of variation within each gender.
Right.
And it's crucial to remember that context plays a huge role.
Like if you're talking to your boss, you're probably going to speak differently than if you're hanging out with friends.
Exactly.
Regardless of your gender.
Exactly.
Now, the textbook, unfortunately, doesn't give too many specific examples
Right.
of how these gendered language patterns play out in Indonesia.
That's true.
But based on your own experiences there, can you think of any examples?
Yeah, so one thing that comes to mind is how terms of address are used
Okay.
in Indonesian.
Mm-hmm.
There are different ways to address people depending on their age, their status, their relationship to you.
Okay.
And these terms of address can definitely be influenced by gender norms.
Okay, so give us an example.
Sure, so like the word kakak can be used to address an older sibling or someone who's older than you. But it's often used in a more respectful way when addressing an older woman than when addressing an older man.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. So even in something as simple as a term of address, we can see these subtle gender dynamics at play.
And I bet there are also like certain slang words.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
For expressions that are considered more masculine or feminine.
Absolutely.
And that probably varies across different regions and communities.
Oh, for sure.
It'll be interesting to like map out all those different linguistic variations.
Right, to see how language and gender intersect.
Exactly. And I'm thinking back to our conversation about bilingualism and multilingualism.
Yeah.
And how those factors might influence these gendered language patterns as well.
Right. That's a whole other layer of complexity.
It is. It's like a giant puzzle
It is.
with all these interlocking pieces.
And each piece is constantly shifting and evolving.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating to study, right?
Absolutely.
We're constantly learning new things about language and how it shapes our world.
Yeah, language is never boring.
Never.
It's a constant source of discovery.
I completely agree. So we've talked a lot about these different concepts.
We have.
But I want to bring it back to our listener for a second.
Okay.
And think about what this all means for them
Okay.
in their everyday life.
Sounds good.
Like, why should they care about these ideas of bilingualism, diglossia language, and gender?
Right. So understanding these concepts can actually help us to communicate more effectively.
Okay, how so?
Well, for example, if you're aware of the different ways that men and women might use language, you can avoid making assumptions.
Right.
Or misinterpreting someone's intentions.
Okay.
Just because someone speaks in a certain way doesn't mean they fit neatly into a gender box.
Right.
So instead of jumping to conclusions, we should try to really listen to the content of what's being said.
So it's about approaching communication with more empathy and understanding rather than judgment.
Yeah.
And that's something we could all benefit from, right? Regardless of our gender or our linguistic background. And thinking about Indonesia specifically.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such a diverse country.
It is.
With so many different languages and cultures.
It's incredible.
How do you think these concepts of bilingualism and language and gender play out in that context?
Well, I think it's important to remember that language is always embedded in a social and cultural context.
Right.
So in Indonesia, where there's such a strong emphasis on harmony and respect, language is often used to navigate those social hierarchies and to maintain those relationships.
And that's probably reflected in how people use language across genders as well.
Absolutely.
So are you ready to jump into part 3?
Let's go.
Okay, so we're back.
We're back.
For the final part of our deep dive.
Part 3.
And we've covered a lot.
We have.
But I really want to bring it all together now.
Okay.
And think about what it all means for our listener.
Okay.
What are the takeaways? Why does all this matter?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that understanding these concepts can really help you communicate more effectively in everyday life.
Give us an example of that.
Sure. So let's say you're aware of the different ways that men and women might use language.
Right.
You're less likely to make assumptions or misinterpret what someone's trying to say.
Right.
Just because someone speaks in a certain way doesn't mean they fit neatly into a gender box. So instead of jumping to conclusions, we should really try to listen to the content of what's being said.
It's about being more mindful.
Exactly.
Of how we use language and how others use language.
And understanding that there's no one right way to communicate.
Right. And this is especially important in a diverse society like Indonesia.
Absolutely.
Where you have so many different languages and cultures coming together.
Right. And these different ways of using language are part of what makes Indonesia so rich and vibrant.
So thinking about Indonesia specifically.
Yeah.
The textbook ends with this really thought-provoking question.
Oh, yeah.
What unique challenges and opportunities do you see in your own linguistic landscape?
That's a great question.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges facing Indonesia is how to preserve its linguistic diversity in the face of globalization.
Right.
You know, as English becomes more and more dominant, there's a risk that some of those local languages and dialects could be lost.
But at the same time, globalization also presents some opportunities for cultural exchange and learning.
Absolutely. I mean, technology has made it so much easier for people from different cultures to connect and communicate with each other.
Right.
And that can be a really powerful force for good.
It's like a double-edged sword, right?
Exactly.
Globalization can both threaten and enrich linguistic diversity.
And I think it's up to each of us to be mindful of that.
To be aware of those challenges and those opportunities.
Yeah, and to use language in a way that promotes understanding and respect.
Absolutely.
Across cultures and across genders.
Well said.
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From unpacking definitions.
We're exploring real-world examples.
To really thinking about what all of this means for us.
Right. In our daily lives.
And for the future of language.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for joining us on this deep dive into bilingualism and language and gender.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone.
Until next time, keep exploring.
Keep learning.
The amazing world of language.
Yeah. Hey everybody, and welcome back for another deep dive.
It's great to be back.
Today we're looking at a really cool chapter all about code switching and code mixing.
Two really fascinating parts of sociolinguistics.
Yeah, and this chapter does a really good job of breaking it down.
It does.
Like in a way that even if you've never heard of code switching or code mixing before,
Right.
you'll be able to understand what's going on.
Absolutely.
And you know what I thought was a really helpful analogy?
Okay.
Is they were talking about code switching like a squirrel
Oh, okay.
that jumps from tree to tree.
Okay, I can see that.
Right. So it's going back and forth between the trees, and then code mixing is like the squirrel staying in one tree,
Okay.
but reaching over to another tree to grab an acorn.
Oh, I like that.
So I thought that was pretty helpful
Yeah, that is helpful.
to kind of visualize what we're talking about.
Yeah, so you can see, like, it's still kind of mixed up,
Mm-hmm.
but not the same as, like, going fully back and forth.
Right, exactly.
So it's a nice way to highlight the difference visually.
Yeah, and they do a really good job of explaining why these things happen and what they mean.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into that.
So to make sure that everyone's on the same page,
Right.
let's just start with some basic definitions from the text.
Oh, that's good.
So code switching, they're saying, is alternating between two or more languages in a single conversation.
Okay.
Like you might say something like,
Yeah.
I went to the mercado to buy some tortillas and they were delicious.
Perfect example.
Yeah,
And even just in that one sentence,
right.
we can see how much, like, social meaning can get packed into that simple switch.
Right.
Right? Like, are they more comfortable in Spanish? Are they trying to emphasize, like, the authenticity of the tortillas by using the Spanish word?
Right.
Or maybe they're talking to somebody who's also bilingual, and they're trying to signal that connection.
Yeah.
So it's not just about fluency, right?
Right.
It's about making a very deliberate choice to switch for a very specific purpose.
So it's kind of like picking the right tool for the job,
Exactly.
but with language.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay, so that's code switching. Now, what about code mixing?
Okay, so code mixing,
The text gets a little bit more nuanced here.
it does get a bit more complex.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with code mixing, it's not just going back and forth. It's about, like, blending those languages together
Okay.
to create something totally new,
Mm-hmm.
where, like, each part might not be easily separable.
Okay, so give us an example. Like, what would that sound like?
Okay, so imagine, like, you're making a dish, right?
Okay.
And you've got all these different spices.
Okay.
You can still maybe taste each individual spice,
Yeah.
but they've all kind of come together to create something unique and different.
So it's more than the sum of its parts.
Exactly.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it.
Good.
So if code switching is like flipping between channels on your TV,
Okay.
code mixing is more like creating a brand new show by combining elements of different genres.
I love that analogy
Okay, good.
because it really highlights that creative element of code mixing. And one of the key things that the text points out is that code switching usually has, like, a clear social meaning
Right.
or purpose,
Right.
while code mixing
Okay.
it might be more spontaneous
Okay.
or playful,
Okay.
especially when bilingual speakers are just hanging out, being informal, and letting their languages flow together.
That makes me think of this example from the text where they were talking about this bilingual kid
Okay.
who asks their mom,
Okay.
Mommy, can we go off Urlaub to Florida this year, please?
Oh, that's so cute.
I know, right?
And a perfect example of code switching.
Right. Because they just seamlessly blended the German word for vacation
Right.
into this English sentence.
Yeah, and what's really interesting there is how context plays a role,
Okay.
right? Like, that same kid might not code switch in the same way at school,
Oh, that's true.
especially if it's a primarily English-speaking environment.
Yeah.
They're going to adapt their language to the situation.
It's almost like code switching is a superpower.
It kind of is.
Yeah, what bilinguals have.
Yeah.
That they can adjust how they communicate to connect with different people
Absolutely.
and kind of navigate all these different social situations.
It's a testament to their linguistic flexibility
Right.
and their cultural awareness.
Yeah. And the text also talks about how code switching often happens when a speaker feels comfortable and recognized within a bilingual community.
Right. They're more likely to code switch when they're with people who understand and appreciate both of their languages.
You know, that reminds me of a time
Oh, yeah.
when I was... Actually, you know what? Let me save that story for later.
Okay.
Because I think it's important to talk about the benefits
Yes, definitely.
of code switching that the text outlines.
Okay.
Because honestly,
Yeah.
I had no idea that it was such a powerful tool.
Yeah, for a long time, people really saw code switching and code mixing as, like, bad language or, like,
Oh, really?
yeah, like broken language.
Wow.
But now research is showing us just how dynamic and complex these practices actually are.
That's interesting.
And one of the biggest benefits is how code switching can signal solidarity with a particular social group.
Okay.
Like you're saying, I understand your culture,
Yeah.
and I belong here.
So it's kind of like using slang
Yes.
or inside jokes with your friends
Exactly.
to show that you're part of the group.
Yeah, it creates that instant bond and a sense of shared identity.
Yeah, okay, I can see that.
And beyond that,
Yeah.
code switching can also allow speakers to express really nuanced emotions
Okay.
and attitudes that might be hard to get across in just one language.
So it's like adding another layer
Yes,
of meaning
exact.
to what you're trying to say.
It's like adding italics or bolding to spoken language.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. You're emphasizing certain words or phrases to convey specific emotions or intentions.
And let's not forget the humor.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Sometimes code switching can be really funny.
Absolutely.
Especially when it's done on purpose.
It can be hilarious.
To make people laugh.
For sure.
Right.
The text also mentions that code switching can make speech more impactful and effective,
Okay.
and more engaging and memorable for the listener.
So you're really using all of your linguistic skills
Exactly.
to your advantage.
To create a more impactful and nuanced communication experience.
That's pretty cool.
It is pretty amazing when you think about it.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about code switching,
We have.
but I think it's time to shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and talk about code mixing,
Yes, let's dive into that.
which is very closely related but also fascinating.
It is.
So the text gives us a couple of definitions
Okay.
from Ward Ha and Poeso Edarmano
Okay.
that I think are really helpful for understanding code mixing.
Okay, so what do they say?
So Ward Ha defines code as the particular dialect or language one chooses to use on any occasion.
So it's really highlighting that the speaker has agency
Right.
in choosing their linguistic tools. And then Poejoso Edarmano adds that code is a system of speech whose elements have special characteristics based on the speaker's background relationships and the situation.
So it's not just about the words themselves. It's
Oh.
about all of the social and cultural stuff
Exactly.
that surrounds how they're used.
All that context.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and using these definitions, the text kind of dives into the specifics of code mixing,
Okay.
saying how it often happens in informal settings and involves a deeper blending of languages where the function and meaning of each element might not be easily separable.
So it's less about intentionally switching back and forth and
Yeah.
more about organically weaving the languages together.
Exactly. It's like when you see those beautiful tapestries
Oh,
where
okay.
all these different threads and colors are blended so seamlessly
Right.
that you can't really tell where one begins and the other ends.
So it's like a unified piece of art.
Exactly.
Okay. And the text also talks about two main types of code mixing,
Okay.
situational and conversational. I'm curious about those. What can you tell us about those?
Well, situational code mixing is pretty straightforward.
Okay.
You're basically adapting your language choices to fit specific situations.
Okay.
So let's say you've got a group of bilingual friends.
Yeah.
They might seamlessly switch to their heritage language when they're talking about family,
Okay.
but then go back to the dominant language when they're talking about work or school.
So it's about matching your language to what you're talking about.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like choosing the right outfit for different occasions.
Right.
You wouldn't wear a swimsuit to a business meeting.
Exactly.
It's all about being mindful of the social norms
Yeah.
and expectations.
Okay. And what about conversational code mixing?
So conversational code mixing is more about the way languages flow together
Okay.
within a single conversation,
Yeah.
regardless of the topic.
Okay.
It's less about conscious switching and more about an effortless blending
Got it.
that comes from that shared understanding and comfort level
Okay.
among bilingual speakers.
So it's kind of like jazz improvisation,
Yes.
where you're just riffing off of each other
Exactly.
and creating something new in the moment.
It's spontaneous and unique.
Yeah, and the text gives some good examples of this
Yeah.
from Spanish English bilinguals,
Like what?
like saying, "No, Vanna, bring it up in the meeting,"
Oh, yeah.
or "Estaba training para pelear."
I love that.
Yeah, and I think that really shows how conversational code mixing
Yeah,
can create a sense of intimacy
definitely.
and shared identity
For sure.
among bilingual speakers.
It's like a secret code that
Yeah.
only they understand.
And the text brings up this really cool study of code mixing
Oh, yeah.
on this Indonesian TV program
Okay.
called Bukan Empat Mata.
What did they find?
They analyzed all these different instances of code mixing on the show.
Oh, why?
Like when they said, talk about just for my mom, hari ini kan dirayakan sebagai hari ibu Nina, saya mau tanya nih pada Vega dan Cynthia hari ini sudah bilang selamat hari ibu ke mama kalian.
Okay, wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, and that gives us some really good insight into how these linguistic choices play out in a dynamic setting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to see it in action.
Yeah, and the researchers categorize those examples as either situational or conversational.
Oh, interesting.
So, for example, they said that the phrase,
Yeah.
I love Ibu from Miyake, which was spoken by a guest star reading a message to her mother, was situational code mixing because it was directly related to Mother's Day.
Right, because they were talking about mothers.
Right.
Makes sense.
But then they also said that phrases like, ladies and gentlemen, Perawan letis ajmut pemen, were conversational code mixing. Because they were used for comedic effect.
Right.
And to create a lively atmosphere for the viewers.
Yeah, and that brings us back to our discussion about the social purposes of code mixing.
Right.
It's not just about blending languages. It's about connecting with people.
Right.
Injecting humor. And enriching the whole communication experience.
So it's a deliberate choice.
It is.
That bilingual speakers make.
Yeah.
To navigate their social worlds and express themselves more fully.
Absolutely.
And even entertain.
Exactly. Code mixing isn't just a linguistic quirk. It's a powerful tool.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It really is.
That something as simple as how we use language can have such a big impact on how we connect with each other.
It's really powerful.
Yeah.
It challenges our traditional ideas about what it means to speak a language.
You're so right. It's not about following all the rules.
Exactly.
And having perfect grammar.
It's about being creative.
Yeah.
And using language in dynamic ways to connect with others and convey meaning.
It really makes you appreciate how complex and beautiful human language is.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it, right? Like, this whole discussion about code switching and code mixing really changes how we see bilingualism.
Totally. Like, for so long, people thought that if you weren't like perfectly fluent in both languages, or if you mixed them up, it meant you weren't really bilingual.
Right, like you weren't doing it right.
Yeah, but what we're seeing now is that code switching and code mixing are actually signs of really advanced language skills.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it takes a lot of brain power to manage multiple languages and choose the right words for every situation.
Yeah, you're basically a linguistic juggler.
I like that.
Race. Keeping all those languages in the air.
Yeah, and seamlessly switching between them.
And you know what I'm realizing is that this isn't just about language.
Right. It goes way deeper.
It's about culture and identity and belonging.
You're exactly right. It's all connected.
Yeah, like when someone code switches or code mixes, it's like we get a peek into their lives and their background.
I totally agree. It helps us connect with them on a deeper level and appreciate their culture.
And that brings up a really important point about language education and how we see bilingualism in society.
Okay, tell me more.
So instead of thinking of code switching and code mixing as mistakes, we should see them as valuable ways that bilingual people express their identity.
I couldn't agree more.
So we should be encouraging bilingual speakers to embrace all of their language skills instead of trying to fit them into a monolingual box.
That's such an important shift in perspective.
Right. Like, imagine the possibilities if we celebrated these skills instead of trying to suppress them.
It would be amazing.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about theory and societal stuff.
Yeah.
Let's get practical here.
Okay, sounds good.
How can our listener actually use this information in their own lives?
That's a great question. I think the first step is just to be more aware of how people use language.
Okay.
Like when you hear someone code switching or code mixing, just notice it.
Right, just pay attention.
Yeah, and instead of judging or making assumptions, just be curious.
Okay.
Like, what are they trying to say with their language choices? What social or cultural stuff is happening there?
So it's like we're becoming language detectives.
Exactly. We're trying to solve the mystery of language.
I love that. And that kind of awareness can help us be better communicators.
Right, because we can start to appreciate all the different ways people use language.
Yeah, and we'll be less likely to judge people based on how they speak.
Exactly. Instead of saying, oh, they're mixing up their languages, we can say, wow, they're really good at using all of their language skills.
And for people who are bilingual themselves, this knowledge can be so empowering.
Yeah, why is that?
Because now they can understand their own language choices better.
Okay.
And they can use code switching and code mixing strategically to achieve certain goals.
So they have more control over how they communicate.
Exactly. So if you're bilingual, embrace those code switches and code mixes.
Yes.
Don't be ashamed of them. They're a reflection of who you are.
I love that. You know what's really fascinating is that code switching and code mixing aren't limited to spoken language.
Oh, really?
You can also find them in writing,
Like where?
Like in text messages, social media posts, even literature.
Wow, so it's not just a spoken thing.
Nope, it's everywhere.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it shows how language is always evolving.
Right, and it makes you wonder what will happen with code switching and code mixing in the future.
Especially with the world becoming more interconnected and multilingual.
Yeah, like imagine a world where code switching and mixing are not just accepted but celebrated as essential communication skills.
I love that. It would be like a symphony of languages.
Right, where everything blends together beautifully.
I love that imagery. It really captures the potential of these linguistic practices to bring people together.
Okay, so this deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me.
For me too.
I feel like I've learned so much about bilingualism and how we use language.
And the most important thing is to keep learning and exploring.
Right, knowledge is power.
Exactly. The more we understand about these linguistic practices, the more we can challenge our own biases
Yeah.
and create a more inclusive world for everyone.
So as we wrap up our exploration of code switching and code mixing today, I think it's important to leave our listener with one final thought.
Ooh, I like a good parting thought.
So here's a question to ponder.
Okay, I'm ready.
How might understanding code switching and code mixing help us be more inclusive and appreciate the different ways people use language?
That's a great question, and I think it's something we should all think about as we interact with people from different cultures and backgrounds.
Yeah. By embracing linguistic diversity and challenging our own ideas about what's correct, we can create a more welcoming space for everyone to express themselves.
Ah, beautifully said. It's about recognizing that different is not bad. It's just different.
And those differences are what make the world so interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We should celebrate the richness and complexity that multiple languages bring to our lives.
You know, it's amazing to think that just the way we use language can have such a big impact on how we see the world and connect with each other.
Yeah, language is so powerful.
Way more than just words.
Definitely. It's about our identity, our culture, who we are.
And, you know, for anyone out there who has ever felt like they had to hide part of themselves to fit in, this deep dive is like a reminder that your language and all its quirks and complexities
Absolutely.
is something to celebrate, not hide.
Embrace it. Be yourself.
Right? Like embracing your whole linguistic repertoire, code switching, and all lets you communicate in a more genuine way.
For sure.
And really connect with others on a much deeper level.
Absolutely.
So to everyone listening,
Yeah.
keep exploring the world of code switching and code mixing.
Keep learning.
Yeah, pay attention to how people around you are using language.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to ask questions.
Exactly. Curiosity is key.
You might be surprised at what you discover.
You might learn something new about yourself.
Exactly.
Or about other people, or even just about how amazing language is.
And hey, maybe you'll even discover some of your own code switching and code mixing habits that you didn't even realize you had.
That happens all the time. It's fun to notice those things.
So yeah, it's a journey
It is.
of linguistic discovery, and we're all on it together.
We're all language explorers, in a way.
I like that. It's true. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive.
Sounds good.
We hope you've enjoyed this exploration of code switching and code mixing,
I hope so too.
and that you'll take what you've learned with you as you continue to explore the amazing and diverse world of language.
Yeah, language is fascinating.
So until next time, keep those ears open, those minds curious, and those languages flowing.
Well said. Keep exploring.
We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive. Welcome to another Deep Dive. You know I'm always fascinated by language, and you sent over some excerpts from Pasted Text, a sociolinguistics textbook.
It looks at how languages change and the connection between language and culture. Should be a fun deep dive.
Yeah. I've been meaning to learn more about this. I've always wondered, like, if learning a new language could actually rewire your brain.
We're going to uncover some fascinating insights together today. That's a great question, by the way.
I know the text talks about this idea that languages are always changing.
Yeah.
Like, I read about how fridge came from refrigerator.
Uh-huh.
It just seems like laziness, right?
Well, at first glance, maybe, but the text says it's not just laziness.
What is it then?
It's efficiency. Like, our brains love shortcuts. It's all about the least effort to get the meaning across.
Oh, interesting.
This principle is called economy, and it's behind a ton of language changes.
Oh, okay.
Like gonna instead of going to.
Yeah.
Or fridge instead of refrigerator.
It's amazing how our brains are always trying to streamline language.
It's like a quest for the shortest distance between thought and speech. But then the text also mentions how the word livid, which used to mean pale, now means the opposite.
Right.
I find it hard to believe a word's meaning could just, slip like that. What happened there?
Well, sometimes a word's journey through time takes unexpected turns. With livid, it probably sounded so much like vivid that people started using it to
Oh,
describe something, well, bright or intense. And eventually it led to the current meaning of angry.
that makes sense. I could see how words could get mixed up if they sound alike.
Yeah.
So we've got economy. What other forces are at play when it comes to language change?
Well, the text outlines several. We've got analogy, where irregular words get reshaped to fit regular patterns,
Hmm?
like how the plural of cow went from the irregular kind to the more common cows.
What?
It's as though the language is tidying itself up, making things neat and consistent.
That's really interesting. Then there's language contact, where different languages kind of bump into each other and swap words,
Yeah.
like sushi from Japanese into English.
Makes sense.
And then, of course, we have language acquisition, where children learning a language might make their own little innovations that eventually catch on.
Interesting.
And sociolinguistic factors play a huge role. New words and phrases can emerge from, social trends, technology,
Right.
even political events.
It makes you wonder, what words or phrases are we using today that might sound completely different 100 years from now?
Now, that's a question for the linguistic time travelers.
Right.
Think about how much technology has already changed our vocabulary.
Yeah.
I mean, words like Wi-Fi
Right.
and cloud computing
Yeah.
would have sounded like science fiction just a few decades ago.
Yeah.
Language is constantly adapting to reflect the world around us. It's a living, breathing entity that evolves alongside humanity itself.
So we've covered how languages change over time in these subtle ways, but the text also talks about a more dramatic phenomenon called language shift.
Yeah?
It's like a whole community switching to a new language,
Yeah.
like a cultural earthquake.
Totally.
Can you give us an example of how this happens in the real world?
Sure, the text highlights some compelling cases. For instance, in South Sumatra, young people are shifting away from their local languages, largely driven by social change. And the desire to participate in a wider, more globalized world.
Right.
They see fluency in a dominant language like Indonesian as key to educational and economic opportunities.
It makes sense, especially in our increasingly interconnected world. But the text also mentions East Timor and their shift from Indonesian to Portuguese. It was triggered by a change in their political situation after their independence in 1999.
Exactly. And it underscores how political factors can also play a significant role after gaining independence.
Right.
East Timor opted to revive Portuguese, a language associated with their colonial past,
Right.
as a symbol of their newfound freedom and national identity.
Those are such powerful examples of how language is intertwined with social and political forces. The text also says that immigrant communities often lose their native languages over generations.
Yeah.
Do you think it's inevitable, or can these languages be saved?
It's a tough question. On one hand, assimilation has its benefits. It can help immigrants integrate into their new society
Right.
and access opportunities. But on the other hand, imagine all those stories, those unique ways of seeing the world vanishing.
Yeah.
There are efforts to revitalize endangered languages, but it's a constant uphill battle.
It's like choosing between integration and losing a piece of your cultural identity.
It is.
What a difficult choice to make. The text doesn't really delve into solutions, but I'm curious, what can be done to preserve these endangered languages and prevent them from disappearing?
Well, there are dedicated linguists and communities around the world actively working to document and revitalize endangered languages. Some efforts involve creating dictionaries and educational materials. Others focus on fostering, intergenerational language transmission within communities. Getting grandparents to speak their native language with their grandchildren, for example. Sometimes even incorporating endangered languages into the education system can help.
It sounds like a challenging but incredibly important endeavor. Imagine the loss if we allowed these unique languages and cultures to just fade away.
It would be a tragedy, not just for the communities directly affected,
Yeah.
but for humanity as a whole.
Right.
Losing a language is like losing a piece of ourself, a piece of our shared human heritage.
Yeah.
Each language carries with it a wealth of knowledge, stories, and traditions
Right.
that enrich the tapestry of human experience.
That makes me think about this question. Can learning a new language actually expand your worldview?
Right.
And that leads us perfectly to the next section where we'll be discussing the mind-blowing Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The text explains that Sapir and Whorf believed that language doesn't just reflect reality, but actually shapes how we perceive and understand the world.
Now that is where things get really interesting.
Right.
Like this hypothesis suggests that our language isn't just a neutral tool for describing reality. It might actually be shaping the way we experience and conceptualize that reality.
This whole idea that language shapes thought.
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing. The Hopi language example where time isn't linear really got to me. Could you break that down a bit more? What's going on there linguistically?
So unlike English, Hopi verbs don't always mark tense in the same way. Instead of seeing time as a straight line from past to present to future, the Hopi language might encourage a different understanding of time, perhaps something more cyclical or interconnected.
Wow.
It's a fascinating example of how grammatical structures can reflect and perhaps even shape a culture's concept of reality.
So the very way they conjugate verbs influences how they see the world.
Yeah.
I had no idea something like that was possible.
It really challenges our assumptions about language and reality. And this is just one example. The text mentions how different languages categorize colors or spatial relationships in unique ways,
Right.
which might lead speakers to perceive those concepts differently.
It's almost like speaking a different language opens up a whole new dimension of reality. It makes you wonder if learning a new language could actually broaden your horizons and change the way you think.
That's a question that many linguists and psychologists are exploring. Some research suggests that bilingual individuals might have cognitive advantages,
Oh, wow.
precisely because they've been exposed to different ways of thinking through language. They may be more adept at multitasking, problem solving,
Yeah.
and even have better memories.
So by learning a new language, you're not just expanding your vocabulary, you might be expanding your mind as well. Now that's a motivating thought.
It is.
It seems like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis really throws open the doors to how we understand language's impact on our lives.
It does.
It does raise more questions than it answers. Even if the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis isn't entirely provable, it provides a framework
Right.
for understanding the complex relationship between language, thought, and culture. It suggests that language is more than just a tool for communication. It's a fundamental part of how we experience and make sense of the world.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder what other hidden cognitive benefits we might uncover as we delve deeper into the mysteries of language. It's like language is this hidden superpower just waiting to be unlocked.
And the more we learn about language, the more we learn about ourselves. This deep dive is a perfect example of that, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. We started with these excerpts from a sociolinguistics textbook, and look where we've ended up.
Right.
It really speaks to the power of curiosity.
Yeah.
And how even a seemingly simple topic like language can lead to such profound insights.
Well said. It's a reminder that there's always more to learn, more to explore,
Right.
and more to discover, both about the world around us and about ourselves.
Before we wrap up, I want to touch upon one last topic from the text that really resonated with me.
Okay.
The idea that language can be a form of cultural preservation. It mentioned how when a language disappears,
Yeah.
it's not just a collection of words that vanish. It's an entire way of seeing the world,
Right.
a unique perspective, a cultural heritage that is lost forever.
That's a critical issue.
Yeah.
Each language carries with it a wealth of knowledge, stories, and traditions that contribute to the richness and diversity of human experience.
Earlier, you mentioned efforts to revitalize endangered languages. Do you have any examples of communities or organizations that are actively working to preserve these linguistic treasures?
Certainly. There's the Endangered Language Fund, which provides grants to support language documentation and revitalization projects around the world. In the United States, there are many indigenous communities working tirelessly to revitalize their ancestral languages,
Oh, cool.
like the Cherokee Nation
Okay.
and the Navajo Nation.
Yeah.
And there are countless grassroots efforts led by passionate individuals dedicated to preserving their linguistic heritage.
It's encouraging to know that there are people out there fighting to preserve these languages and the cultures they represent.
It is.
It's like they're trying to save a species from extinction, but in this case, it's a species of language.
It's a fight worth fighting.
Yeah.
Linguistic diversity is just as important as biodiversity. Imagine a world where everyone spoke the same language.
Yeah.
It would be a much less interesting and vibrant place.
It would be like looking at a world in black and white instead of full color. We'd lose so much richness and depth of understanding.
Precisely. Each language offers a unique lens through which to view the world. When we lose a language, we lose a way of understanding human experience,
Right.
a way of connecting with our past, and a way of shaping our future.
This deep dive has been such a fascinating journey. It started with the evolution of words and ended up with the preservation of entire cultures.
Yeah.
And we couldn't have done it without the insights you've shared from the pasted textbook.
It's been a pleasure to explore these concepts with you. It's a reminder that learning is a lifelong process, and there's always something new to discover.
Right.
Especially when it comes to something as fundamental as language.
I couldn't agree more. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive, I have one final thought-provoking question for you.
Okay.
So if I'm getting this right, different languages actually categorize things in different ways.
Exactly. Like some languages have super specific words for things that English just lumps together.
Okay. I'm ready for some examples. Hit me with them.
All right. So like in Japanese, there are different words for carrying a person on your back versus carrying an object.
Interesting.
In English, we just use carry for both.
Yeah.
Or like some Aboriginal Australian languages have incredibly detailed systems for describing spatial relationships.
Wow.
Ways that go far beyond our simple left and right.
It really does seem like speaking a different language could kind of open up a whole new dimension of reality. Do you think learning a new language could actually broaden your horizons and change the way you think?
That's a fascinating question. Many linguists and psychologists are exploring this very idea. And some research even suggests that bilingual individuals might have cognitive advantages.
Oh, cool.
Because they've been exposed to different ways of thinking through language. They may be more adept at things like multitasking, problem solving, and even have better memories.
So by learning a new language, you're not just expanding your vocabulary, but you might be expanding your mind as well. Now, that's a motivating thought.
It is. It really is.
It seems like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis really throws open the doors to how we understand language's impact on our lives.
It does. It raises more questions than it answers, that's for sure. Even if the hypothesis itself isn't entirely provable.
Right.
It gives us a framework for understanding the complex relationship between language, thought, and culture. It suggests that language is more than just a tool for communication.
Right.
But a fundamental part of how we experience and make sense of the world.
It really makes you wonder what other hidden cognitive benefits we might uncover as we delve deeper into the mysteries of language. It's like language is this hidden superpower just waiting to be unlocked.
And the more we learn about language, the more we learn about ourselves.
I think that's really true. Like this whole deep dive has been such a great example of that.
I agree.
You know, we started with these excerpts from a sociolinguistics textbook, and look where we've ended up.
Right.
It really speaks to the power of curiosity and how even a seemingly simple topic like language can lead to such profound insights.
Well said. It's a reminder that there's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to discover about the world around us and about ourselves.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to go back to something from the text that really resonated with me.
Okay, what is it?
This idea that language can be a form of cultural preservation.
Yeah.
It mentions how when a language disappears, it's not just a collection of words that vanish, but an entire way of seeing the world.
Absolutely.
Like a unique perspective, a cultural heritage that is lost forever.
It's a critical issue, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Each language carries with it a wealth of knowledge, stories, and traditions that contribute to the richness and diversity of human experience.
Earlier, you mentioned efforts to revitalize endangered languages.
I did, yeah.
Do you have any examples of communities or organizations that are actively working to preserve these linguistic treasures?
Of course. There's the Endangered Language Fund. It provides grants to support language documentation and revitalization projects all over the world. And here in the United States, there are so many indigenous communities working tirelessly to revitalize their ancestral languages.
That's great.
Like the Cherokee Nation
Wow.
and the Navajo Nation. And those are just a couple of examples. I mean, there are tons of grassroots efforts as well, led by passionate individuals who are just dedicated to preserving their linguistic heritage.
It's encouraging to know that there are people out there fighting to preserve these languages and the cultures they represent. It's like they're trying to save a species from extinction, but in this case, it's a species of language.
It's a fight worth fighting. I totally agree. Linguistic diversity is just as important as biodiversity, in my opinion. Imagine a world where everyone spoke the same language.
That's a scary thought.
Right. It would be a much less interesting and vibrant place, I think.
It would be like looking at a world in black and white instead of full color. Like we'd lose so much richness and depth of understanding.
Exactly. Each language offers a unique lens through which to view the world. When we lose a language, we lose a way of understanding human experience,
Right.
a way of connecting with our past, and a way of shaping our future.
It really makes you think. This whole deep dive has been such a fascinating journey.
It has.
Like, we started with the evolution of words and ended up with the preservation of entire cultures. And we couldn't have done it without the insights you've shared from the pasted text textbook.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to explore these concepts with you. It's a good reminder that learning is a lifelong process.
Yes.
And there's always something new to discover, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as language.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, so before we wrap up our deep dive, I have one final thought-provoking question for you. Throughout this deep dive, we've explored how language shapes our understanding of the world. But what about the flip side? Could the world be shaping language in ways we haven't even considered?
You're thinking about the dynamic interplay between language and the world around us.
Absolutely.
It's not just a one-way street. The pasted text excerpt focused on social and historical influences.
Right.
But there are so many other forces at play.
Like technology.
Exactly. Think about how technology has introduced a whole new vocabulary into our daily lives.
Yeah.
Wi-Fi, cloud computing, artificial intelligence.
Right.
These weren't even words a generation ago.
Crazy, right.
And it's not just new words. It's changing how we use language. Well, think about it. Social media, texting, video conferencing, they're all shaping our grammar, our sentence structure, even our nonverbal communication.
Yeah, that's true.
We're expressing ourselves in entirely new ways.
It's almost like language is constantly trying to catch up with the pace of technological change, and in turn, it's influencing how we perceive and interact with that technology.
Totally.
Like this incredible feedback loop where language and technology are co-evolving.
I like that. A feedback loop. And it's not just technology either. Think about our evolving understanding of science, the environment, even social justice movements.
Yeah.
These shifts in our collective knowledge and values inevitably leave their mark on language.
So new discoveries lead to new words, new concepts, demand new ways of expressing ourselves. Language is like a mirror reflecting the ever-changing face of humanity.
Precisely. And that's why the study of language is so captivating. It's not just about grammar rules and vocabulary lists. It's about understanding who we are,
Right.
where we've come from, and where we're headed as a species.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexities and the power of language. From the evolution of words to the preservation of cultures, it's clear that language is much more than just a means of communication.
It's woven into the very fabric of our existence. It shapes our thoughts, defines our identities, and connects us to each other and to the world around us.
So, dear listener, as you go about your day, pay attention to the words you use, the way you communicate, and the subtle ways in which language shapes your understanding of the world. You might be surprised by what you discover.
And remember, language is never static. It's a living, breathing entity that evolves alongside us. Embrace its dynamism, explore its nuances, and never stop being curious about the power of words.
Well said. That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of language and culture. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.